The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that the majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı. Ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and today we have Stephan Hammel from the Measures Taken podcast and from a bunch of artistic stuff. And we're going to actually talk about the history of communist aesthetics, communist relationship to art, proletarian art, prolet cult, why the Frankfurt School ruined everything, and other things that may be obscure at first, but we will try to clarify. The people enjoyed our last epic episode. However, the one complaint that I generally got, in so much that we got one, is that we didn't actually give quite enough of the actual history when we were talking about things. So today we'll try to do a little more of that. I always like to start off though by talking about the little bit of aesthetic writing that we have from Marx and Engels, mostly from Marx, actually. Mm-hmm. Marx basically says that socialist art in his time period, which was mostly social realism, although to call it social realism is a little bit of a misnomer, as his critique of it is that it was highly sentimental, and actually reactionary artists tended to be more honest and thus better.
Like Balzac. So the example here is Lassalle's play, which takes place in the Middle Ages, but is supposed to include political commentary for the present and meant to perform an educative function, versus Balzac, who's an out-and-out royalist, but nonetheless whose observations about French society are scientific enough that they nonetheless reveal the structure of
So Marx is always writing about Balzac and Steinhall, both of whom are reactionaries. So
he promises to write a book on Balzac, and we don't get it. It's one of the many books by Marx that we don't have.
Yeah, like the other volumes on bourgeois society beyond capital, all of them.
Right? Or the rest of Capital.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly. Since we have unfinished volume 2 and 3, and then Theories of Surplus Values, volume 1, 2, and 3, none of which are finished.
Disaster.
So this leads us to, well, this led communists into kind of a cul-de-sac. The Second International writings on art, they kind of exist, but they tend to exist actually more in like the debates around Otto Bauer about the national question and national cultures, or early stuff on Russian futurism, etc. But you don't actually get that much out of the Second International on aesthetics.
No, and I want to make a distinction just helpfully right at the beginning between writing on art, of which there was a huge amount, and aesthetics, philosophical aesthetics. So philosophical aesthetics coming out of it's really new, only comes out of the 18th century. The earliest writings
really starts with Kant, right?
Well, Kant is reading people like Baumgartner, but there are some people in the Enlightenment tradition who have isolated the sensuous experience of the world as a field for philosophical inquiry. Kant systematizes aesthetics, or at least introduces aesthetics into his system, as a way of uniting moral philosophy and the theoretical philosophy, uniting the first and second critiques. That whole, to put a fine point on this, or what Kant thought was useful here, I think it's fun to point to his theory of disgust. So his theory of disgust is it's an aesthetic response, right? Obviously, it's not fully conceptual; it's subjective, and therefore not, it's not an objective claim about the world. But it nonetheless reveals to us in sensuous form something about the moral character of what's being reacted to, and something about its irrationality, which is, of course, underwrites his moral theory entirely. So he thinks it's connected to the rational experience in an important way, in an ineliminable way, but is nonetheless not part of cognition, properly so called. Now, that thought about related but unrelated to propositional, cognitive, contentful knowledge is going to haunt the tradition. First of all, it's going to form the basis for Hegel's aesthetics, which is, of course, as we know, this is our zeitgeist aesthetics, which changes over time, in which various forms of life come into dialectical contradictions with themselves, only to be superseded by other forms of life, each one of which goes through a period of severity, classicism, and romanticism, wherein spirit's self-conception, which is what the arts are meant to be, material, sensuous self-conceptions of societies, they go for a period of severity when they have only an indistinct notion about themselves, through a period of classicism where they have a complete and beautiful notion of themselves, and then finally to a period of decadence, which always lasts longer than you think it does, and wherein all those conceptions become hardened and stiffened, and they've stopped being able to reflect the social form of reason appropriate to that particular time and place. Mm-hmm. Here's the problem. Here's where it goes off the rails. Goes off the rails because Marx and Engels, and you're absolutely right to start with them, Marx and Engels do not give us an aesthetic theory. They're interested in the arts. So we get writings about the arts. Even Engels, and this is my favorite little tidbit, there's a beautiful little article out there that just traces everything they ever said about music, and it's mostly Engels. Other than like references to Wagner and Marx and references to Mozart and Marx, Engels actually tries to write like 4-part harmony at one point in his life, which is hilarious to think about. Either way, we get writings on the arts. This is not an aesthetics. It's only later on when Marxists try to pick up an aesthetics for Marxism, they don't try to develop their own. They borrow the Hegelian conception of aesthetics in writing about art and get themselves tied up into knots. And we're going to go into detail about this, I hope. Tied themselves into knots about trying to decide, well, what art expresses bourgeois society at the moment, for example, of its heroic emergence, or perhaps at the moment of its decadent fall. And if you have that notion, you can easily ask the question, well, what proper art, literature, music, the fine arts in particular, what is appropriate to the proletariat at its rising stage? And what's classical proletarian art? So that's gonna cause a discourse that's only there because we don't have an aesthetic theory from Marx and Engels. And all they had was Hegelianism. And so I'm talking about the 1920s. We start to get these neo-Hegelian Marxified versions of an aesthetic theory. It's a mess.
I mean, what's interesting to me about that is there's a parallel discourse in the sciences where Hegelianism also emerges and becomes its own kind of problem. We can think about the empirical criticism versus monism versus Pannekoek's particular reading of stage theory of science, where in Pannekoek's reading, each epoch has its mature science, and for the bourgeois it is natural science, and for the proletariat it is social science, but we're not actually going to define that. And by that we kind of mean Marxism, but we can't even define what that is. So you have a parallel discourse there that, interestingly and unfortunately, the science discourse in Marxism has continued degenerated for another 100 years. But the aesthetics discourse on Marx is from the early, because when you say it comes from the 1920s, what's interesting about that is, as I said, there's not any aesthetics in the Second International, and in the 1920s is when the Second International more or less dies.
Yeah.
So then we're left with, why was there a need for this neo-Hegelian? Our chief offender of most things neo-Hegelian ends up being Lukács. But why was there a need for this? And then, as a secondary note that we'll come back to maybe later, but why does it come back up in the 70s and 80s? Because that's when all these things get reprinted and rediscussed.
So glad we're talking about this, because you're gonna make me think of things. I think this is supposed to be my bag, right? Marxist history of music is supposed to be my bag, but you're gonna make me think of things. Okay, let me address the first part, which is, well, why the 20s? Or let's put that the other way you put it, which is, why not the period between the 1870s and the 1890s, where we think of the heyday of the SPD? Well, one way to think about this is how much art was going on in the early days of the SPD. I mean, by the early days of the 20th century, you already have Lenin writing this congratulatory letter to the choral societies of Germany, which have organized workers in the hundreds of thousands, all the way up. I mean, encompassing the most orthodox workers to the most revisionist, country, southern German towns, singing all these patriotic songs. That tradition starts off as a bourgeois tradition of self-made music and folk song singing, and gets adopted and apotheosized by the working class. I take it that these choral societies were naturally a form of proletarian self-organization. And they really modeled all kinds of other things, like literary circles and, proletarian poetry. The prolet cult stuff comes from somewhere. It comes from spontaneously organized proletarian art societies in which workers made art for themselves, which should be just like easy to embrace as a tendency. It's untheorized at the time. It's only after that gets decisively crushed that the philosophical problem reasserts itself. At least that's my sense.
So I think this is interesting to go back maybe to the British example of Christopher Codwell. Codwell, again, unites these two discourse patterns. And despite the fact that I'm a poet, I've actually been more interested in the scientific discourse. But Codwell's theories in bourgeois culture and decline, the trouble with physics, all these things that he was doing were very much based partly in his English understanding of early Leninist writings, and we'll come back to that. But also that he didn't separate the aesthetic question of bourgeois culture from the scientific question. He saw them as different, almost artificial subdivisions, like the artificial division between politics and economy in mature bourgeois thought. But the aesthetics question, again, we talk about it comes back up in the 70s, where it really does. And a lot of what these people are responding to are like official late Communist Party codifications of Lenin's writings on aesthetics, and which are the Revolutionary Art book. You're right, doesn't tell you crap. Like, I've read it, it's not useful. But I'll let you talk more about that in a second. And then also on people like Codwell in the English tradition, because you didn't have a whole lot else in the English tradition. And then elsewhere in the German context, and even though some of these people were writing in the States at the time, they're debating in German, and a lot of it was untranslated for a ridiculous amount of time, even though some of it was written in the US.
We've talked about the gaps in the translation history.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. I'm going to get Ben from Marxism Translated on to talk about how much we really don't have and why maybe we don't have it.
Yeah, you should. I'm going to give that guy a rose. It's crazy. Anyway, go on.
Yeah, but back onto that. So you have this whole thing which culminates in like Raymond Williams, workerist thought. Then you have that's one school. A school though that puts commercial proletarian art separate from this early tradition, but somehow a continuation of it. And then you have the radical disjuncture of the Frankfurt school, which comes in the 30s and 40s, which says that, well, even that proletarian art isn't really proletarian art in the capitalist world because it is a product of a culture industry, a mass-produced, marketed product, which is by the bourgeois for the proletariat, and may be produced for proletarian taste, maybe. But whatever that is. But also you have in this writing, you have the general Frankfurt School tendency after the 1930s to dismiss the idea of proletarians' role in history altogether. This increasingly is a part of their thinking, and it's kind of ignored by a lot of people who look at the Frankfurt School now.
It's anti-workerism. It's the opposite.
Yeah, that it has a strong anti-workerist bias, and like politically, philosophically, etc. And they basically, from the authoritarian personality on, and Adorno and Horkheimer have criticisms of that study, etc. I mean, I think Adorno implies that it was cheap positivism that they did to get funding or something. But
whatever positivism is, but
positivism applies to anything that might look like science sometimes, and other things that doesn't look like science if Adorno and Horkheimer don't like it.
That's right. Yeah.
But whatever positivism is, the way they use it. I mean, by the 60s, they're accusing Marx of positivism. So, like, who knows what it even means?
Yeah, well, it probably means nothing. But let's be careful about, because you started it with the British tradition, which I think is really important. What you just said, did you just say Stuart Hall as a workerist, which I think is really funny? Did you tie him to like Birth of the Working Class, or what's that book, that famous book, The Emergence of the Working Class in Britain?
Yeah. E.P. Thompson.
Yeah, I think that there is that connection there, which I hadn't really internalized, but they're really adopting this sort of cultural studies. They really found this cultural studies mode. And it has a lot of resemblance and a lot of differences with the Frankfurt School. I think the political differences are important, and you've already alluded to them. But I want to talk about their similarity for just 1 second, which is they both share what I take to be a realist conception of art. So, and I mean this in, usually the Eastern Bloc, bad old Soviets, when they talk about art in their Zhdanov addled minds, they think, they think that it has to be something called socialist realism, and that this is a style of art which we can, I suppose, only locate in painting and literature. Once you get to music and dance, it completely falls apart.
It's really in sculpture too. But but you're right. There's no like socialist realist literature is in film are like, well, what even is that? Like, I don't know. I've looked at a bunch of Moss films, including non-famous ones. I mean, like, I don't, other than when this is like clearly the shittiest of agitprop about like how workers are super beings or something, that that I don't know what worker, like social realist aesthetic. You can't really accuse Eisenstein of social realism or anything. I mean, still socialist realism, even though he probably was marketed. Well, I shouldn't say marketed in context of the Soviet Union, but
no, that'll get you into trouble with at least one of your viewers. You get this conception of a realist conception of art, and that roughly translates into, there's art that accurately expresses the thing that only art can express, and there are things that don't accurately express the things that art can express. And art should, because it's under the control of the people, it should express the truth about social life. It's a lot like how sociology is the science of the proletariat. This realist conception, properly conceived and executed, would be the foundation for a socialist-based art, maybe an art in socialism. I take it that the whole conception is overly Hegelian. That is, the idea that the fine arts are distinguished from the rest of the arts, that there's something fundamentally distinct between the labor of a musician and the labor of a cobbler, let alone a proletarian worker on the line. And that difference is not one of privilege, not one of control over the means of production, not an economic difference at all, actually. It's a difference in the kind of endeavor that the fine art is engaged in. The worker, the cobbler, the clockmaker, might be a privileged artisan, but they aren't producing work that has a content that speaks to the meaningfulness in our lives or the meaning of our society or our values. That expressive content in art that's assumed to be in art is peculiar to the fine arts. I take it that a Marxist shouldn't take that idea seriously. I mean, maybe this is a difference between you and me, but like my ultra cold stream approach is to say that there are meaningful differences between these types of arts, but they're all economic and everything else is ideology. There is nothing that expresses, there's no kind of thing we do that's peculiar because it expresses the content of the zeitgeist.
Yeah, I would say, weirdly, I find that argument, when you think about it, oddly similar to the concept of like market popularity indicates art quality, because it shows the knowledge production in some kind of market knowledge machine form of the preferences of the general public in that time period, in that place. Except we don't want to use, markets as an epistemic marker and thus as a judgment for other things, which is his own problem. But therefore we just have to be, well, the true content of art is basically what reflects what we think the world is, and thus, and I find it interesting because the socialist realism problem, and we can go back to the pro-cult stuff in a minute and going all the way back to the organic arts, the SPD, but the socialist realist problem actually recapitulates the social realist problem of the early 19th century, where yes, we're trying to show the truth about the worker, but go back and read those books in Europe in the 19th century, in America in the late 19th century, very early 20th. Some of them around socialist by that point. A lot of them are sentimentalized pablum. Like I can't, like I've tried to read Sarah Orrin Jewett and Upton Sinclair and this, that, and the other, and like I immediately go, well, Marx was right about these guys. Like there's not the realism here is projection and then some sob story poverty porn to hold it all together. And it was also, frankly, a kind of, I think the reason why it's picked up by editors, it was a crash attempt to expand their market downward, but have more respectability than the Penny Dreadfuls and other, more salacious but non-permanent literature. And we forget about the magazine market of the 19th and early 20th century, which was gigantic and mostly literature. And in fact, a lot of Cosmo, of all things, started off in this time period as like a literary magazine. And some of them are still literary magazines up until the 1960s. And they're actually where you find a lot of this social realist work. And what you find interestingly in the Soviet example, not so much with the SPD, but is that they kind of, the work they produce apes this, but from like a more like officially, formally Soviet communist aesthetic. And then you see this even more so in the mini films of the Cultural Revolution period in China, when they actually have the money and time to produce films, where they're really doubling down on what basically art as pure agitprop.
Yeah, the Chinese example is going to have to be separate. But
right.
But let's go back to what you said about well, first of all, I want to remark, ladies and gentlemen, this is how widely read he is. He's read all of the issues of Cosmo back to issue 1. First of all, but I want to bring that topic back to trash for the masses, because this is a frequent topic of debate among Marxists, right? This will happen in Adorno. Do we like the culture industry, or do we not like the culture industry? Here again, I want to abandon any notion of the specificity of the fine arts or the separation of the fine arts from the rest of the arts. And if you do that, then you notice that, well, let's take it for granted that novels have some use. They have some use, or else they wouldn't be commodities. That's part of the assumption we make about when we analyze society. I don't know what those uses are. They're probably really myriad and complicated, and some other kind of researcher can look into that, I suppose. But they're meeting whatever use they're bought for. And perhaps that's, to identify with a character or know something about your society. But it's not rare in capitalism that some commodity is shitty at what it's at the use it's supposed to serve, at the need that it's supposed to meet, but nonetheless gets mass produced and sold. There's no distinction here between like a really low quality tire and a really low quality novel. I mean, they're both going to get sold for those who can only afford the low quality equipment
for everyone, and you get what you pay for, kind of. I mean, except when you don't, but still.
Well, swindling always happens, but it's not peculiar to capitalism,
right? No, that goes back to as long as we've had money.
But you see what I mean? Like this whole question isn't a problem if you just don't distinguish it from the other parts of the economy. The culture industry, if it's an industry at all, and I don't take that it is. In fact, if anything, it's the industrial phase of culture, not the cultural phase of industry. So it's just this moment where we turn out to mass produce things that we used to produce for ourselves. Well, that's not, again, this isn't rare in the history of capitalism. This is true of textiles, the very first industry to be capitalized. So there's something that's not mysterious about this. The mystery comes in when you think that the arts not only reflect our social values and who we are as a society and our deepest truths. They inform them such that they're like the unconscious of society. And in fact, if you go back and study its art, the art of a society, you will find its innermost nature. And that art was, in turn affecting values. So here it would be really important, for example, if that's true, it's very important to police art then. I mean, you got to make sure that your art isn't teaching the masses the wrong values.
Right. Which has always been, we'll get to this with Lenin and revolutionary art and why this comes up in the 1920s, because I think we have kind of in this very peculiar way, and audiences should be warned when Stephen and I talk, we do this. What gets you there, because the didactic purpose of art and the communist mind, because of its Hegelian assumptions about paragons, basically, of each stage of a mode of production, also informs that mode. And I hate to say this because I don't want to give people who believe in cultural Marxism or Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracies fodder, but liberals have at least convergently developed, or if not just ripped off Marxist, and from my studies a little bit of both actually, a similar theory about social values in art, which has been highly unproductive, but does create an entire chattering industry about it.
Yep. Yeah. Suddenly we have to police things. The policing of art, with what's at stake in the policing of art, is whether or not we are going to be subconsciously affected by our consumption habits, and if some of those consumption habits are spiritual. I mean, that's the thesis, right? Sometimes we're eating bread and sometimes we're eating God, and we should make sure we're not eating the wrong God. That's the thought.
And unfortunately, until even in the 2007-2008 period, the revival of Marxism, even in its early phases related to the crash, people forget this now, was not in political Marxism. It was in, quote, academic Marxism, and mostly in searching popular culture for the manifestations of ideology, whatever that is. Thank you, fucking Zizek and a bunch of other people. But that became one of the mass means of repopularization of Marxist ideas. The other reason why is, unlike in economics, historiography, and aesthetics, Marxist ideas were not seen as anathema in the academy, and so people were quoting Webb and Williams in the 90s, and that was and also Althusser, and that was frankly for me being told to teach a class on literary criticism when I was 24 years old.
Really?
Yeah. To undergrads as a burgeoning MFA student, to go back and read Althusser, whom I hated and kind of still do, but that was the key. It was where Marxism was safe, even in the super reactionary period after 1992. Whereas even in left corners in that time period, the only people proposing Marxist economics would have been the academics associated with specifically Trotskyist movements, which had large student groups, and it was very hard to get the actual research. And if you were, and most of it at that time was from the 70s, and like you can actually see this. I mean, if you want to look at like the commentaries on Das Kapital, for the longest time you have Mandel's and Fine's, and that was it. Fine's first edition, and I think Mandel's is the 60s. Fine's first edition's in the 70s. You don't get anything new until David Harvey in 2008, and then you get a bunch. But like, and by the way, for people who are looking for things in regard to capital, Fine's introduction is pretty good. But my point here is that you can see during this time period, aesthetics is where it is safe to be a Marxist, and the other place is historiography, where even conservative historians take Marxist historiography somewhat seriously.
It should never be safe to be a Marxist. If it's safe to be a Marxist somewhere in society, that you should reevaluate
Right.
the reality of your political commitments and make sure that they match to your self description.
Right. Well,
Um,
for example, Frederick Jamesman's what an aesthetic reading of Capital, which is one of the most ridiculous things I've ever read. And I don't
It's
even dislike
bizarre. I
that.
mean, I said this the last time we had a conversation. The university is built to poison brains, and it's got lots of gatekeeping technologies in order to make sure that its ideas conform ideologically. So here's a perfect example where it codes as Marxist. Now, and I think you'll agree with me here. You said the word Marxist, but what you mean is what they mean when they say the word Marxist, which is that it comes from the historical positions of political parties that call themselves Marxist. They don't mean that it's continuous with the theory as we find it in Capital.
Right.
Those are two different things. So yes, it was held. These sort of naive views, heavily informed by philosophical aesthetics, especially Hegelian philosophical aesthetics, and then spun through a number of sophistications. Those were commitments held by actual Marxists in history. It has exactly nothing to do with historical materialism. In fact, there's been a kind of taboo in the history of Marxist writing about the arts to treat the arts to treat the art industry as nothing more than as no more special than the transportation industry. And in socialism, I mean, we're going to have to organize all forms of labor, art laborers, along with all the other kinds of labor. There should be no distinction between the two if we think that both are needs meeting forms of human activity.
Which is a question I think that a lot of socialists leave open what we think by needs. Unfortunately, I've found that a lot of socialists believe the caricature by conservatives that we don't think anything that isn't just about bread is important ever. In that we don't think there would still be expressions of individual spirit or whatever in socialist plan society. I find all that to be ludicrous, but it is interesting how many socialists effectively believe this too. You even see it in stuff with the stupid memes about the poets, and I'm like, part of the promise of socialism is we don't all just do one thing.
Sure. I want a baker in the morning and and someone else at night, and
right. It's
definitely.
like, yeah, I mean, so it's not like you do physical labor and then you can only be physical labor with a commune poet. And in fact, the foundational texts of Marxism make that very clear. And yet even Marxists will throw those memes around. And it confuses me as to what they think they're saying. But to go back here, Prolet cult is interesting because, and you have two kinds of Prolet cult. I find it interesting that people forget that the Dutch Council Communist tradition was also really in the Prolet cult, because it's not totally consistent with the way people view them in their resurgence in the 90s.
I haven't looked at that, by the way. That's a good tip. I haven't looked underneath that rock looking for that yet. So thank you for that.
So you have that, but then you have the Prolet cult that was kind of convergent with also Russian futurism, both of which Lenin takes a skeptical eye on, and then later we see her just abandoned entirely.
Well, look, you got a bunch of people in Russia who are doing some what for the time is pretty sophisticated aesthetic theory. There's a collection on my shelf over there called I think it's called Art as a Form of Cognition, which is a lot like this thesis where art's just a form of communal cognition about itself. And so they've married this idea in and outside the Bolshevik tradition. Inside the Bolshevik tradition, now we're thinking of someone like Bogdanov, who's involved in party education, who, he also plays these editorial roles. He takes over as editor of an early Bolshevik edition of the translation of Capital. He's editing the project in which they're trying to decide which Russian word they use to translate value, which is a hugely important problem in the Russian language for describing Marxist theory. So it's not like he's just some crazy art guy. This is someone we actually do have to take serious. It's one of the reasons I'm currently going through Red Hamlet and digging into this guy, because we mostly ignore him. But his conception of proletcults is pretty simple, which is that the proletarians need to self-organize for their own education and for their own cultural edification, and therefore there ought to be autonomous proletarian art societies. This is not unlike what spontaneously happens before. The big difference, however, is that this is in the context of building socialism, which means, are these just cooperatives? Is this a weird Prudhonism of the arts? In which in the interstices of capitalist society, a proletarian culture will emerge, and by virtue of its superiority, maybe its greater efficiency, maybe its greater ability to meet the needs of workers, takes over of its own accord without a political transformation. I mean, that's a kind of Prudhonism of the arts is one way of understanding that project. It's not Trotsky's objection. Trotsky is going to come around in 1920. I'm going to get the state wrong. 20 something, someone look it up, where his objection is it's worse. His objection is, well, look, the proletarian phase is the transitional phase. I mean, it's the transitional phase from capitalism, which is already decadent and breaking down, to socialism, which is not yet fully built, and capitalism will have had its an art fit for the expression of the values of its ruling class, and socialism will have completely different values, and it will emerge spontaneously as doing what? Expressing the social values and deeper truths of whatever the socialist society comes along and does. We don't need a proletarian culture in the middle steering the way or even leading the way.
Right.
So that's
what I find interesting about this is prolet cults kind of denounced by the party later on. Partly, I mean, if we're completely honest, some of it has to do with factional tensions between Bogdanov and Lenin.
yes.
Within the Bolsheviks itself, not just about ideas. But what I find even more interesting about this is this question doesn't go away. This is actually, again, to bring up the Chinese example, without reference to Bogdanov or prolet cult, the ideas of mass line art and this, that, and the other also come up organically and separately in the Chinese Revolution, and an even more didactic attitude towards art. One that people have argued is informed by Chinese legalism, and as well as, if not more so than Marxist-Leninism, starts to develop, and then this becomes tied into interestingly though, like with prolet cult, the idea of spontaneous self-organization of the culture of the mass of society, be that the agrarian worker or the industrial worker, up to and against the capitalist roaders or bureaucratic collectivist or whatever. I mean, I find it hilarious actually how much that Maoism in the context of itself replicates some of the questions of Trotskyism, but in slightly different language, so you can't see it. And then also a different faction Maoist win, which obscures the fact that there was ever a debate in the first place, because both sides claim the mantle of the same person, which is not what happens. It would be like if the left communist, the left opposition, and the right and the center all claim Stalin somehow. And I guess you do kind of have it, with the exception of the left. No, even with some of the left communists, they're just not in Russia. They're in the Italian context. Everybody claims Lenin.
Right. Easy too. He dies at just the right moment.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So this leaves us with this question, and Lenin really is the person who puts this out there at about the same time as they try to squash the monism debates, of which Bogdanov is also implicated. So again, the question of aesthetics and art and the questions of science and this transition to socialism are directly tied together, which is one of the reasons why I think it's important we explore this. So what's also interesting is the argument that Trotsky made, because Trotsky's argument I think is very bad, but as a kind of, in a vulgar sense, if you believe in the Hegelian typologies, and then you say, well, Dick Prohl is like, it's the state we accept, why we still have to have some form of classless society as the bridge into unclass society, as per the critique of the Goethe program. Then why should we be pushing a proletarian culture? Wouldn't that reinforce proletarian relations, which we are trying to get rid of? And while I think that argument's actually ultimately kind of dumb, it is one that in the Hegelian context when you see these transitions as typological,
Yes.
as opposed to, material, makes a lot of sense. And this also leads to the third thing that comes back up, and this is past Lenin, this is in Stalinism. Well, although we've rejected pro-cult because of a bunch of reasons, including that it weakens the party and recapitulates some of the stuff from the early Soviets, but in art form. But Stalin starts codifying, and people wonder where the Chinese got this from. This is where.
Yeah, it is. The Stalinist period is interesting because, okay, so here's my painfully naive historical materialist thesis about the content of art. The content of art is determined by whoever controls the production. So, my favorite example is if you've ever looked at, so there are all these actually pretty spectacularly wonderful operas for
the gatekeeper theory of art.
It is kind of, there are all these 17th century operas for the glorification of King Louis XIV, right? So they're these Sun King operas. Of course they are. And they all have about an hour and a half of prologue. What's the function of the prologue? The function of the prologue is to celebrate the king for his victory at whatnot. And why is there an hour and a half of celebrating the king? Because the king controls the producers, because he controls the production process. This is the same thesis about the news, right? Why is the news, bourgeois? Well, for a very straightforward reason, which is that major corporations own the papers.
Right.
Look.
And also, why should you read financial reports to get decent news? Because the bourgeois don't lie to themselves.
That's right, which is a Noam Chomsky line. I hate to tell your audience.
Yeah, I know. It's actually one of the three things from Chomsky that I think, well, he's right about that.
Yeah. That's right. If you control the production process, so insofar as the workers don't control the production process, guess what? They don't control the content of anything they produce. Why should they control the content of the arts? The arts aren't special. That's my thesis the whole way through.
Yeah.
It gets perfectly bad in the Soviet Union. Because in the Soviet Union, who's controlling the arts? Well, it's going to be these sort of like party officials who are in charge of organizing the massive and incredibly sophisticated. I only know about the musical history here, but I mean, in the musical legacy, the Soviet Union is one of the great triumphs of world historical civilization. They were
the film legacy too, honestly.
Right. Yeah. And I'm sure visual artists and literary people who are interested in books. I don't read books, but I don't read novels. I'm bad at it. But I'm just not a visual guy.
Novels is a weak part of the Soviet Union. Soviet novels don't tend to hold up that well unless they're dissident novels. And there's maybe, again, that may be partly because in our society, we don't get the good Soviet novels translated that often. But at this point, I don't know that would be the case.
That's fascinating because that's really, really fascinating because it's sort of the opposite in other cases. But anyway, my point is a very sophisticated art production system, one that had been in place since the 18th century and only gotten better. They're producing some of the best music at the highest quality levels in the world, and so that this has to be run by a network of bureaucrats. And the content of these pieces is like sometimes free and sometimes not, but not for a mysterious reason.
Right?
It's a perfectly straightforward reason that has nothing to do with Marxism.
All right. I mean, you have true gifted artists who can. I mean, it's interesting about Soviet film. We can talk about in aesthetics because my love of Tarkovsky. It is interesting what Soviet film does. In general, is that it has a different conception of pacing and time than Western film, particularly in its high art films, but in general. But a lot of it's stuff for mass production. What started happening as early as the 50s and definitely later is that the planners tried to give people what they wanted, but what they wanted was often Western and capitalist. So you had the development of the Soviet television industry and film industry, which kind of ate the capitalist system, the capitalist production, because they didn't know what else to do. And they thought, well, we'll just take this, there's something good here, and just put the better ideas in it. And what I also find interesting, even in the course of Soviet film, a lot of the better films are by people who are at least uncomfortable with, if not outright hostile to, the Soviet Union. I mean, Tarkovsky is kind of a religious reactionary. Like, well, I don't even think kinda is fair. Maybe
No, he's out and out a religious reactionary. I've seen Andrei
like,
Rublev too.
Like, and yet he not only got that movie made, he got the movie made under the Mosfilm that was appointed by Stalin.
Yeah, look, they're only policing the content they feel like they need to, and it's super uneven. Of course, it's going to be super uneven. But the Soviet Union did not degenerate because because its art inaccurately
absolutely not.
reflected
In fact, it has no relationship whatsoever. And what I find interesting about this is my feeling is very similar to your kind of gatekeeper theory of art, which I'm going to call it, because I think that's pretty much what it is that, like in the capitalist world, art does have some feedback function on reinforcing relations of production. So we can't say it's totally superstructural, but it is mostly superstructural in that what art sticks and thus is marketable is recognizable to the society at the time. Which also means, this is one of the things we can talk about, now you and I are going to sound like conservatives who blame all cultural wokeness on Hegel. But there is a certain sense, except they would blame Kant, which is particularly hilarious because right now the popular Twitter discourse blames, half of them are blaming Kant for wokeness, and the other half are saying that Kant was, the reason why Western philosophy was white supremacist somehow.
Oh, well, anyone who's a white male can be white supremacist on Twitter. But what's Twitter again?
It is an ungate-kept market.
I just keep forgetting what it is because it stops being. I even have colleagues. I unfortunately and embarrassingly, and probably only for the moment, work in a university, and I'll get colleagues of mine come up to me and say things like, "Didn't you hear about the big scandal at Harvard?" And I'm like, what big scandal at Harvard? I read the paper every day. And they're like, oh, well, it's blown up on Twitter. And this is the yellow press. This is like self-made yellow press.
Yeah, it is self-made yellow press. So what I find hilarious is back in the day when I was, you and I are almost the exact same age. When I was on LJ, and people can guess at what it is. When I was on LiveJournal, that's how I tell you I've been on the internet. There was advice when I was a MFA to never have a public blog.
Wait, why? What was the?
Because they were letting that like they were using that in tenure reviews, and then teachers were also getting fired for it back then.
Yeah,
and with Twitter, that's completely gone. And now, and I think and people do occasionally still lose their job over tweets, but it's funny how, in some ways, it indicates how non-dangerous this stuff is because it doesn't have the same consequences anymore.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about superstructure and base for a moment, because I just want to clear up a potential confusion among a lot of Marxists. A lot of Marxists worry about this relationship. It doesn't look like you can have an economic explanation for the progress of history if you can't have the distinction. However, every version of the distinction that appears to be on offer looks unacceptable on its face. Yeah. So there's this.
And
there's
self-contradictory, probably.
And discourse on the arts is infused with anxiety over over superstructural and of course, you get these terrible anxieties. Like, there's, for example, there's a passage in Marx where he's talking about whether or not the pianist creates value. It's like, good. Yeah, that's what I want to know. I want to know, does the servant, create value for the Lord or not? Right. And it turns out not. In what moments does these artistic labor produce value? Those are very, very important distinctions. They're going to be distinctions that are important when we dismantle the capitalist system and replace it with the socialist art system. But if you're concerned about superstructure and base, my solution to this problem is the arts are base. They're not superstructural at all. Instead, there is a huge amount of discourse about the arts that is superstructural, and that has to do with concrete things. So, for example, Base would be the social relations we enter into in, let's take my example, right? So the social relations we enter into in the music making process of the technology that we use, both intellectual technology, these heuristic ideas that allow us to perform complicated functions and enact complicated skills, and of course, material technological conditions to produce the most of the most sophisticated of whatever you're doing, right? So in the case of music, it's as many voices and as complicated as possible for meeting as many needs as possible. Okay, well, you've got all of those basic things. And then there's social relations that go along with them. Then there are a series of rules. There's a series of norms and a series of rules that articulate for the practitioner and lots of times for the consumer what's going on here. There are concepts that regulate. It's the regulation against parallel fifths in music. There are a number of other ones.
Right.
That's superstructural. Because superstructure is about rules. The rules that rule the basic economic function are superstructural, properly so called. But if you're worried about base and superstructure, I've got your solution. It's all base.
I've been trying to make this point for years. Like a lot of stuff that people think like culture is superstructural. I'm like, if it involves material production, a commodity, or a relation, it's actually in the base of the society. Which is also, I mean, to get us back here, back to the beginning, because we go off on these tangents.
Yeah.
So we have pro-cult developing. Pro-cult's initial impetus, though, is from the spontaneous mass co-option of bourgeois nationalist art by the SPD. And what people forget, because no socialist grouping in America or even in the world really that I know of, maybe outside of the CPC in China, because the CPC is technically in control of so much, but even then I'd actually probably guess it's not as strong as people think, having lived there. Lived in the region. So my point only on this is there's nobody organizing mass workers' art anywhere in contemporary society in a way that parallels what was going on in the SPD and the internationals, broadly speaking, both the first and the second, and also the other functions of union culture. And while this happened parallelly in Europe and America, they happen for different reasons. In Europe, it was that the unions were increasingly incorporated into a single apparatus in the state, be it Italy, Sweden, or whatever. In Italy, this is a holdover from the fascist period, actually, that's maintained by the socialist and communist parties, weirdly, but it is. And in Sweden, it's because of all the dual power stuff is eventually incorporated into the state as part of the state institutional apparatus. You have this done a little bit in the English-speaking world through the social welfare programs, and that's particularly like Canada is big on this, producing more art with some governmental base to provide more than what the market would normally provide to express Canadian, although it's really become a way for U.S. movies to make for U.S. movie companies to make money for cheaper and get some dollars to Canada.
Plus, now, you can't have a Canadian national consciousness because Canada is a binational society.
Right? Yeah. Well,
sorry, I'm a French Canadian.
People in the new world don't understand what national consciousness means. They think it means the consciousness of the state you're living in, because both Canada and the United States has been desperately trying to synthetically build some sort of national consciousness the entire time. But my point is, though, in America, the difference is unions get more and more incorporated into the functions of regulating workers, partly because of the social compact largesse, where it seems like there really can be a Fordist detente between the classes for whatever reason. People forget that that's what drives in the 50s and what Fordism really was, which was a way to, like, we don't need socialism because we can work with the unions ourselves, and we don't need even government. We don't need welfareism. We do it ourselves.
And the workers make enough to buy a car anyway, so who cares?
Right. And then you have increasingly you have the limitations put on unions by the Labor Relations Board on what is legitimate and illegitimate union activities. And the membership starts really declining in the 60s. And so we also don't have those traditions. But honestly, those traditions were never that strong in America. You only really see them around like the weird socialist recapitulation of hymns and like the IWW.
Okay, all right. Too much on the table. We got to
Right.
divide out these. There's so much on the table. Okay. Let me say this about. Let's bracket the IWW, but we're going to come back to it. I was looking for a pencil. Before.
This is why people get mad at us, because we go over too fast.
They do. I know. It's just that there's a lot to think about here. I'm glad you brought up unionization. Unlike sculptors, I mean, you have to let me know if I'm wrong, and I'm probably wrong about the other arts, but I don't think the other arts are as saturated with unionism as music. Music has
it's like film and music and theater. That's the only arts that are super saturated. Everybody else is kind of resistant to it.
Not an accident. And here's a thesis about the culture industry, so-called. I mean, if you think there's something like that, then I think it begins in opera in the 17th century. That is, for the first time, you will get a whole bunch of different kinds of craft laborers who are brought together, right? Painters, musicians, actors, singers, all kinds of poets, all coming together to produce a kind of total artwork. This will produce a Wagnerian image later on, which is more left than people give it credit for being. But either way, you get for the first time this, and for profit, by the way. In Venice, this is a for profit for ticket sales. And its content becomes trashy. I'm telling you, its content becomes trashy immediately. Once opera goes from the court, where it's these mythical subjects. Why? Because the gatekeeping theory here again. Why? Because it's the noble ones who want their own values reflected at them. When it's for the public, it's a bunch of sex scandals and blood. So
and you see the weird hybridization of this even further back, like in the British revenge tragedy market in the beginning of the early modern period of Shakespeare, where you have the trash, but then because they still need royal patronage, you have all these classical allusions and stuff like weirdly pinned together in a way that, like, if you think about the Shakespearean audience, half of the audience at any given time is only going to get half of what is going on because it's aimed at two different social classes simultaneously that don't actually catch each other's references.
That's a really good point about Shakespeare. That's a really good point about Shakespeare. My point is about industry. That is, this is an arts industry. And therefore, in certain kinds of artistic fields, unionization, once it becomes relevant in an industrial society, one that's robustly industrial, I'm talking about the mid of the 19th century, you start to get musicians' unions almost all at once. There are musicians' unions in the United States at the time of the First International. Now, they don't join the First International. They're not that progressive. In fact, they're not that progressive at all. Why aren't they that progressive? Because they're craft unions. And so the unionization history is relevant to at least music history, but unionization is only relevant to certain types of productive endeavor. And it happens to be those forms of productive endeavor wherein the producers control let's say a significant share or enough of a share of the means of production. In the case of the musician, this is obvious. You cannot take the skill out of the violinist's hands. Just not gonna be able to do it. There's brain stuff and muscle memory stuff that's just in the body, and therefore you can't proletarianize a skilled laborer if there's no other way to socialize this labor. So there becomes a question. I mean, even today, by the way, we're getting union struggles in San Antonio. I think the San Antonio Symphony is still on strike. So from the very beginning, I mean, this is why all the industrial cities in the United States have symphony orchestras, all of which are unionized. Even in Detroit, to this day, they get paid ridiculous sums. Not ridiculous, sorry, well-deserved sums. Value all kinds of labor, even craft labor of this kind, and in regressive unions. But the point being, it's tied into this industrial system. And that's because of its craft unionism. So there's a question. If the labor can't be socialized, that is, it can't be socialized immediately. I mean, maybe it's just, you can't do to it what we did to textiles. You can't do to it what we did to shoes or to clockmaking or to any of these other industries. That's true. What ought we to hope for? Well, one answer was the Federal Music Project, right? So this is that short-lived FDR project. Let's call this the Bernie Sanders Green New Deal model of the arts under socialism, where the state So here's an instance where
I'm
a
highly
violinist
optimistic about both sides of that, but go ahead.
yeah, in fact, I was thinking about the only thing I'd ever write for Jacobin is a critique of the Green New Deal model, or let's call it the Federal Music Project model of the arts administration. Lots of well-meaning people, but what did you do? You auditioned for the state blind auditions, just like in an orchestra, right? Behind a scrim, faces turned away, so you only listened. It was fair, it was professional, and then you got sent by the state wherever the hell they wanted to put you. And they funded everything from symphony orchestras to folk ensembles to music education and the rest of it. This is the statist model. You said before, outside that context, the market isn't going to pay for it, and the need's just going to go unmet, which again doesn't distinguish it from any number of other needs that go systematically unmet in society.
Yeah, like most of them. So I think that's a very fair point, and I think it's something we have to think about in regards to art, and why a lot of these socialized arts they're not proletariat art, like they never were.
They can't be.
Yeah, right. And you made another point about unions that I could go off all day on. I mean, the whole industrial union versus business union versus craft union. I hate to tell people that out of the 19% of the United States, or 17% of the United States is still unionized. Not only is a lot of it public sector, and thus the battle is with the government, and it's also because the government still administrates things on lines that are very similar to industrial warehouses. Actually, that's part of why. But the other issue is that most of these are craft unions. For example, I mean, I hate to tell, I don't mean to, I'm not saying these people are not workers. All right, for people get on to me about this, and that they can't. But
they
be
do
radical.
have petty bourgeois values.
Are they can't be radical? For example, I mean, the nurses' unions and the teachers' unions are some of the more radical unions, but we are craft unions. And one of the interesting things about the nurses' unions is they're one of the few unions that still can reach across the country, and thus actually have a mass, not just a sectional or a specific site response, but a national response to a crisis. But so there's some complications there. But the craft union model is out of the medieval guild model. And to bring this back to Shakespeare and the like going way further back than people realize, but what did Shakespeare do with effectively his right to rents that he was granted by the crown for his performances at the Globe? Well, Shakespeare's part of the transition actually from of the English early modern period from a court economy to an agrarian capitalist economy, because Shakespeare took his money, and what he did was loan grain out and reinvest it in farmers.
Dude, you're singing my song. I can't. You're reaching into my brain and pulling out monkeys. Here's what happens even earlier than that. So let's put the Shakespeare plays right around 1600. Go back about 50 years in Florence. The people who originate what we think of as today as like a quarterly based, all music was vocal music with melodies draped on one another. And at some point they made an efficiency technology shift where they shifted to chords with the melodies draped over them. Which of course destroys the voice leading of those accompanimental voices, and of course the independence of voices in general. But it does allow for a huge amount of efficiency, and so the number of compositions goes like this. There's a whole economic history to music making that just generally goes ignored. But it's all by way of saying what does Giulio Caccini in Florence, who works for these noblemen, what does he do? He invests. Well, he buys a villa outside of Florence, but with the rest, he invests in the early textile industry. It's the early textile industry. That's exactly right. So it's part of this global transformation. All of what we think of as the height of the Renaissance arts, including Shakespeare, and I just added a musical example to your excellent point, is that's because it's part of this broader transition. But they're never going to make it all the way, and there's no such thing as proletarian art, because art is a form of craft. You can't own nothing and produce art. You have to own some modicum of the means of production. So the solution becomes a little like what Mike McNair says about teachers. It's the same with teachers. Teachers are highly skilled. I mean, we're not at the YouTube level yet, and we will, but We'll get there, but we're not at the level where the computer can like teach you everything yet. So there have to be.
No, they
teachers.
tried it in South Korea and it failed utterly with English teaching, actually. But go ahead. But
God,
yes,
yeah, nightmare. No, for the moment we need teachers, and thank God because it's all unqualified to do. But we're gonna have to bring them under control of a workers' democracy, and then immediately, and here's my programmatic statement for today: immediately begin the process of democratizing all of those skills that are monopolized by an intelligentsia. So all of the basic music making skills, all of the basic drawing skills, all these skills that are now wrapped up in a little intelligentsia that's protecting its interests. Those are going to have to be broken. So those organizations are going to have to be brought under the direct control of a workers' democracy, and then we're just going to like we taught people how to read. We're going to have to make as broad-based an effort to democratize those skills in order to break the power that they have.
Yeah, it was like back when I was still a former paleoconservative trying to work through these things on my own. In about 2005, 2006, I realized how big of a problem the police unions were before it was cool. And I was like, well, how would we fix this? Why don't I take a key from the industrial union model and say the government workers unions, but now the police are not protecting their own craft. Whatever. Now they're actually subject to the whims of all the government workers. And I've been big for advocating, for example, that teachers unions, I hate that they include administration, but they are technically kind of sort of workers. But that we no longer have separate unions for staff, that school staffers should be in the same union as the teachers. Because right now we are often at odds with the school staffers union, and stuff like that. So, I want to go into these craft unions and we'll get back to aesthetics here. The craft versus industrial union, actually there's multiple. There's also the business union, because business unions are not technically craft unions. Craft is every profession on site has its own unions. It's not just that. It is also that the union's function is not just to protect the worker from the boss, but to protect the craft as a whole. So, for example, craft unions make it hard to scab.
Yeah.
Right? It's very hard to scab on teachers.
Basic function.
Right? That's a basic function that actually gives us an advantage in surviving over industrial unions with semi-skilled labor. I'm going to say semi-skilled in quotation marks because I don't actually mean it's low-skilled. It's just
it's part of their legacy in the guild era. It's part of the guild legacy. So, I mean, my favorite example is I live, three hops from Disneyland, which is sort of like living at the edge of Mordor. But there's this hierarchy in the number in performers, and the stunt artists in the Phantasmic shows, they have a union. But if you're one of the dwarves on the ship that goes round and round, you don't have a union. You're at will employment. And why? Because there's a skill that that union has a role in credentialing. Mm-hmm. And therefore it's really hard to, yeah.
But what I find interesting about this, though, is the arts that did not unionize. So, for example, writers who work for big industries, for television or for film, are unionized. Yeah. Writers who don't can join the freelancers union so that we can get insurance. That's really what it's for. That's really all that it's for. I'm not in the freelancers union because I'm in a teachers union and I have insurance. But like that is part of that because certain arts are still highly individual in a way that it's even hard. From the writers are like desperate to get other people to do our craft, actually, so that we can justify our existence.
Please compete with me.
Yeah, please compete. Yeah, exactly. We're over competed anyway. We might as well just give this shit away for free. So
they're honest.
And so that has a different model, and you don't have a novelist or a poets union. Right? They might exist. I don't think they do.
There might have been one in the Soviet Union. The Soviets might have built one for them.
Right.
But
the union model, Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about the Soviet Union model versus the Chinese Union model is Soviet still has sectional unions. So, but that means like each sector had its union representation. The Chinese model has the all Chinese union. That's it.
Really?
And it's not involved in labor at all. It's like they're the people who go out and give you cookies. They're almost, I hate to say this because this sounds insulting, but their function from everyone I've known who I've talked to about China is like, yeah, they're kind of like the PTA, but for labor.
Which means they work for the bosses.
Yeah, yes, and like they'll go and give you like special stars during Workers' Day or whatever. But almost all union actions in China are illegal, and they're never formally recognized. Although the state informally recognizes them all the time, and will make deals with workers. They just won't do it under. They won't do it under the formal guise of a union, which is interesting because that is not the Soviet model. The Soviet model was based on the Soviets, and then from that you still had sectional unions that could represent sectional interest in the Soviet Union, kind of as autonomous, but they couldn't really. I mean, they couldn't strike. I mean, that wasn't possible. But
you know what's funny is that this comes close to this idea. I mean, to circle back to the culture industry concept for a second, which is a concept we haven't really done the Adorno critique yet, and
we haven't got to the stuff we said we're going to get to. So.
I know, which we started off thinking that we'd dominate this conversation. Well, it reminds me of this concept because if you go back and look at the dialectic of enlightenment, and for the record, by the way, I don't think there was a dialectic of enlightenment. I'm in trouble with already I can't even enter the door with critical theory. But if you go back and look at that,
you got kicked out of the kingdom.
Oh yeah, no, look, I thank God I'm not in a humanities school, but I'm in a school of the arts. But if I've been to their parties, and it's very, very easy to believe things out here where it's contentless because you have no responsibility over the object of of your views. Anyway, I've been kicked out, but you look at the references in the culture industry chapter of Dialectic of Enlightenment, and you're going to find Friedrich Pollock everywhere. Mm-hmm. Friedrich Pollock has a thesis about how these state capitalists, they're not really capitalists anymore, because what's happened is that the dialectical, let's say the internal contradiction of capitalism has stalled. It's been superseded by monopoly, but it's just the success of what all the Austrians thought would always happen, which is that you'd get a monopolized system, perhaps administered by the state. But in those circumstances, and here's the puzzle for them, in those circumstances when you have a bureaucratized control over everything, you also have bureaucratized control over idea production, and therefore identity thinking. That is, all predication for Adorno maybe, but identity thinking becomes incredibly dangerous. And it's one of the reasons why there's a lot of talk about whether or not Adorno is mean or racist, or he's anti-jazz, anti-pop music, and whether or not this is a form of elitism. Mm-hmm. No doubt he's an elitist. That's a boring.
He would even own that, I think, actually. But...
Totally own that. No, it comes from his political economy. It comes from his political economic presupposition, which at the time of writing was so obvious to him that it didn't require a separate argument. So, he just assumes that this state form of totalitarian, capitalism, not capitalism, is just going to take over. It's the future. Friedrich Pollock has already seen the Soviet Union and has told us about that. And so now the problem becomes, how do we create difference? How do we create difference of idea, some material way to destabilize the unity of concepts, the ability for concepts to graft upon the world? And it's here that he reaches back to the Kantian idea of aesthetics, back beyond Hegel, to this idea that there is, in the sensory world, there are material impetus for, let's say, the systematic failure of rational cognition, that art can present us with a material truth that exceeds somehow conceptual sublation or subsumption, and by virtue of doing that, indicates that there's something more beyond the conceptual architecture offered to us by a total society, by a total totalitarian society. Well, look, if you don't get in the door with that political economic supposition, then the whole culture industry problem just falls to the ground.
But we should go back for a second, because one thing I've noticed, back into this for a second, the assumption of the administrative apparatus state, which is what Pollock really refers to it in this translated English, it rhymes with the managerial state from James Burnham. It rhymes with it actually, frankly, rhymes with even late Trotskyist bureaucratic collectivism.
Sure.
What that new theory of this comes from is accepting somehow that the war somehow put managers in such control that the heroic epoch of entrepreneurial capitalism was over, which I think everybody did agree with. But that because of this, the fundamental rules had changed, and that Hilferding's monopoly or financial capital and the monopoly capital thesis that operated on Espay Day had actually been in operation, but it was just the bad managers that won. And the only difference between the Burnhamite thesis and the Frankfurt School thesis, frankly, was who was a good manager, and then how would you fight off the Weberian, brutal intellect barbarian of reasonness that's implied by either the military or industrial managers in a totalitarian society, who Burnham will celebrate, actually. I mean, Burnham's second book is just like how great the military management staff is. Or it's his third book, but whatever. It's the modern Machiavellians now, is what it would be called. And I say this because this actually undergirds, though, not just Frankfurt schoolers, because the monopoly capital thesis of Paul Sweezy, which even people like Christopher Lasch took seriously, also argued this separately, that state capitalism was so advanced from the imperial thesis of Bukharin and Lenin that it couldn't still be capitalism. That it was something like bourgeois socialism, and that all we needed to do was either regulate it through this aesthetic function or to democratize it via the state and then operate it but through nationalization. Those were the two models of how to deal with state capitalism. Most of our theories today in regards to aesthetics, and even people I like, I'm a scholar of Christopher Lasch, I like him, but this is still a working assumption in those texts that we do not have, but we have imported their aesthetic, cultural, and
conclusion. Yes,
we have imported them into our discussion of this, that, and the other, which is why socialists have given up on making socialist art for the most part, or even workers' art. What most of them now do is socialist commentary on art, which is the Jacobin model of, this is cool, but it would be so much cooler if this pop thing was socialist.
Look,
which is like 10 years of half of Jacobin's aesthetic criticism, but whatever.
Well, it's easy for me to hate Jacobin because I'm jealous of their circulation.
Yeah, of course, we should be. We should all be mad. We should all be mad also what they've done to Austro-Marxism, but that's a different question.
Almost certainly. The point, though, about political economic presuppositions leading to aesthetic conclusions that get independently accepted by people who no longer hold those political economic presuppositions, that is a pattern that happens over and over and over again. And so it's in fact, it's a form of ideology critique to point that out, I hate to say, but this even persists with people who don't think we're in such a totalitarian period anymore. State capitalist period anymore. People think that we went through this other period called the neoliberal period, which is exactly the opposite, right? It's the effort to reprivatize everything away from the state, away from centralized control and the ownership of managers to some other free market thing, like the rebirth of free markets. And so suddenly there was a critique of neoliberalism and neoliberalist culture, art, music under neoliberalism.
Which we still only we hear this more now today than we even did 10 years ago.
And it's even less, it's even less true today. I'm not a phase theorist of capitalism anyway. I don't think Marx was a phase theorist of capitalism. There's nothing about the MCM relation that goes away or comes back or becomes freer or more totalitarian. So, meaning people will retain the conclusion about the arts, right? The need to, the ideological function, the policing function that it has, the way in which it's the unconsciousness of society, the way it expresses our values, et cetera, et cetera. They'll have all of these conclusions, but it'll be divorced from all of the sociological truths that made them meaningful.
Right. And so And what replaces it now is, instead of the administrative state, it's the corporations rent seeking. Although they would say profit mode, not rent seeking motive, because they don't really understand modes of economic. But whatever. I won't get all snarky about people's being stupid with categories. But regardless.
Yeah.
What you have here is just it just shifts the subject, and also shifts the subject of the enemy of who's controlling this. It also shifts what things we should be policing for. And so instead of policing against identity thinking and for difference, now we're policing for identity thinking, but only specific identities which are deemed to be non-monolithic. And I once got in trouble because I was like, cultural Marxist theories are basically Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy theories writ large, and you should admit that. All that said, there is one rational core to them, and that is there really has been an attempt to maintain Marxism through cultural analysis based on the academy, And what I would also say is this isn't just true of the Frankfurt School. This is also true of the English workerists, like Raymond Williams, E.P. Thompson,
Stuart
Hall, basically everyone but Codwell, who's from an earlier tradition.
Yeah, I was gonna say, isn't he dead by I don't know
he's
when
way
he died.
dead. He dies in the Spanish Civil War.
Yeah, okay, there he is.
So what you have here is this counter thing. It's like, oh no, well, yes, bourgeois production, blah, blah, blah. We're not going to really look at that. We're going to look at what the culture, the proletariat enjoys and valorizes that, because we're going to valorize the proletariat as it exists in capital. And there is a little bit of where I can see a continuity between that and the organic origins of pro-cult when we talk about these we might call cultural appropriations, but I would call working class recuperations of bourgeois culture.
Let's get canceled tomorrow, shall we, Varn? Tomorrow.
I've been trying to cancel for years. If you don't care, it's really hard to do. It's one of the things that I noticed, though, is that's used as a justification for understanding the production of art for the quote proletariat. And by that, they often don't mean, even though these are Marxist to them, their political economy would be fairly rigorous Marxist in their definition of working class. But when they talk about working class in this way, they actually tend to switch to a Bourdieuian model, which I know I'm mispronouncing for people who speak French, of class as they mean the working poor, in the culture produced for the working poor.
Yeah, that's right. It's important to remark that that the Marxist theory of classes, which is incomplete and contested, it's where the massacre breaks.
It doesn't even have its formal definition, because Marx quits writing when he arrives to it in Volume 3, as we've said multiple times.
Well, whatever it is, it's not a segment of the market, right? It's not like a consumer.
And it's explicitly, as stated in both the critique of the Erfurt program and Engels' critique of the Alfred program, not about your income ratio.
No. In fact, the level of exploitation has exactly nothing to do with how little you're paid. It turns out, you can be highly paid and heavily exploited. No, that's right, and it's not for the masses. However, I want to defend one element of for the masses. In fact, I want to bring back the IWW.
Let's go back to the IWW movement. Okay.
Listen, you're on a picket line, and it's cold, and someone gets up and starts singing, I think I saw Joe Hill last night as plain as you and me, and what thought you're 10 years dead, and then whatever, you can't kill the dream. It goes on to organize. When you hear that and everyone gets moved, as far as I can tell, that's a use value. I'm pro propaganda. Propaganda meets a need. Sometimes you have to become brave in order to do something hard.
Let's talk about the sociological origins of the IWW kind of him, because you're not just right about that element of it. It was also in response to churches going out and singing at the unions to try to convince them, as when some of the churches were being used to shut down unionization. Now, what's interesting about this, actually, as a mild footnote that I'm just going to note here about the way we interpret culture now, is the religious movements that were most sympathetic to workers and didn't do this are the ones we think are the most reactionary now. That's Pentecostals, Baptists, basically what will become the basis of the evangelical movement. They were actually pretty pro-worker in general. Because
it's Protestantism, yo. I just made this argument to my music history class. It is Protestantism gives us the singing traditions that are the root of democracy. So if you think, German nationalist movement, and that's where the workers are getting their choral tradition, and that's where, and then skip a few, and you go to the kind of peasant singers, and then you merge the two in the American folk experience. You go all the way back, and you're going all the way back to the Anabaptists. I swear to God.
Yeah, because they're crucial. I hate to say it, and this I sound like because there are Catholics who say this, but they mean it as a bad thing. But I'm like, no, I mean the bourgeois revolutions actually do start with religious reforms and in the Protestant Reformation, because it literally breaks up the different concepts of sovereignty, and starts valorizing production for its own sake, as opposed to a role in the great chain of being or whatever, and that fundamentally changes things. And bourgeois culture is not long to follow. And Marx doesn't talk much. This is more Weber stuff, but Marx actually does refer to this once when he talks about in the Brumaire. Actually, when he talks about why the incomplete bourgeois revolution of England had to wear the clothing of the Bible, whereas the bourgeois revolution of France has to wear the clothing of Rome.
Yeah, well, 100%. I am pro the Protestant choral tradition for Marxism. You ever seen shape note singing? Do you know what that is?
Yes, I do. Yeah,
unbelievable. Just for the audience, I'll summarize what that is. So go YouTube it is the first order. The second thing is it's basically a form of singing in 4 parts that was designed for illiterate people to be able to sing elaborate music, 4-part harmony music of hymns, and it is the most democratic tradition of music making you could imagine. Everyone sits around a circle. A new person every song gets up to lead it. They all sing the syllables, the solfege syllables, the do re mi syllables. They're not do re mi in this tradition, but bracket that for a moment. They all sing the syllables first, so that the musician part is there. That's democratizing the musical skill, and then they all sing the words because they're all collectively in control of the content. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Now, does that mean that it's the model for socializing the arts? No, there are some deep technological inefficiencies here, but perhaps there's room for a little combined and uneven development. Anyway, all by way of saying we should be singing more.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's like many elements of bourgeois culture, we often forget that at one point the thing that we hate now is actually progressive compared to the thing that we don't hate anymore because it's not around.
Not around anymore.
So
yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, yeah. This is the queer embrace of aristocratic culture. Is it regressive? Well, it's hard to tell because Marie Antoinette is dead. I mean, really dead. So it means something else, right?
The Auchan regime, in so much that it still exists, except in England, where there's some kind of symbolic hangover, has all been incorporated in the bourgeoisie now. So they're not a separate thing anymore. And I think prolet cult was interesting in that it does exist in this weird context where you're trying to transition to something new by recognizing where the proletarian was, but then it gets into the once you abandon prolet cult's organic, even though it does have the standard critique of prohunism for arts. Mm-hmm. The one thing that it did do is it had the idea of, with the Soviets, that you are listening to the workers themselves, and this is what is producing what we want. And we aren't bureaucratizing that with someone not involved in production. And I hate to say it, this problem, I don't hate to say it actually, this problem comes back up in the actually existing socialist cultures over and over and over again, long after people had mostly forgot what prolet cult ever was. I mean, Bogdanov's like, rehabilitation is basically thanks to Brill. Let's be honest, and like a few neo-Kautskyist really, being like, oh, he's not really that different from Lenin, and like, yeah, no shit.
Right, which, as we discussed before, is not actually properly a political tendency.
Right,
it's merely an orientation toward the tradition. No, I agree with you entirely. This problem about the worker, is the worker being told what to produce, or is the worker in control of the? This is it's a kind of rank workerism because it's missing the component that I called for before, which is yes, we do want the workers in control of production. We want the workers in control of all production, and therefore, what the gatekeeping model means, they should be in control of the content of production, but not individually. Not outside the context of the disciplining of the salubrious disciplining of a workers' democracy, because they're producing, insofar as they're producing a social product. Look, singing "Happy Birthday," is not social production. Singing in the shower isn't social production. Tying your shoes isn't social production. These are things that don't need to be socialized. They're forms of human endeavor and they're creative activities and stuff. But come on, right? What we're talking about is music making at the social level. If that's what's on offer, then yes, of course it's controlled by social production, right? It's not just organically up to the workers. That means you think that, there needs to be some content there that's like naturally expressed, some mysterious inner that needs to be made outer. If it doesn't work for shoes, it shouldn't work for the arts.
Which is, remarkably consistent of you, because it's also very similar to your rejection of Otto Bauer's national thesis. So, as a person who is more agnostic, but kind of leads towards your position, because I haven't ever been able to figure out, like, well, what do we mean? Like, and how do I decide what a nation is? And who do I empower? And what subdial? I mean, like, we talk about the national problem, like I've had with the Kurds and with the Slavs and this and the other. It's like, well, which dialect do we privilege? How do I take this ragtag, barely related tradition of subcultural whatever, and incorporate whatever into it? And also, like, at this point, most of you guys speak English or are Arabic now anyway. Like,
yeah, no, it is a lot like the national question, actually. And the arts question comes in and folds like this into the national question, because the way in which, especially during the Popular Front period of the global CP,
oh yeah, now we're getting to the bad stuff.
The good stuff and the bad stuff. Sorry, so remember that I'm pro propaganda because it performs a necessary function sometimes in a military context. So I'll at least save that usefulness for it. But okay, now we have to talk about the bad stuff, which is, of course, the global. What do? They actually do exactly what Trotsky warns in art and literature. I'm sorry, what's it called? Revolution in literature against, which is the peasant singer. And boy, do they push the peasant singer. Why? Because it's tied to the national question. I mean, how many folk movements? I mean, even the United States, our folk movement is driven by the CP in the 1930s.
Yeah, I mean, people. It's not just a black belt thesis; it's all the folk movements are driven by the CP, so that you can have so that you could settle American nations and sort it the way the Soviets tried to do Eastern Europe, and we see how well that's worked out.
The most successful philosophies of music history in the United States are downstream of Black nationalism.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and that's also, I mean, it has led to good things like the codification of Black culture. It also led to the reason why we had a lot of Black artists in the 30s and 40s is the CP patronized them at middle class wages through not even through membership. They were doing it through like Comintern expansion gifts, which is why we had people like Paul Robeson. And honestly, it's also when it started to fail, it is, it's why we had Lorraine Hansberry. It's also why you had communists in the arts meeting with the fucking president's brother.
Strange Fruit's my favorite example of the point of indistinction between these two, because it's written by a Jewish communist who actually goes, he goes to high school with James Baldwin. His name is Abel Meerspohl, and he writes this poem and he publishes it in a labor magazine, and he's trying to get a composer to put his lyrics to music. What is it? It's an anti-lynching, basically an anti-patriotic, we wouldn't have lynchings under socialism sort of point, which is total CP propaganda, and in a good way, in the most exalted way. And he ends up in a collaborative way, composing the, who wrote Strange Fruit, by the way, is a historical mystery, and everyone has various positions on it. You'll have Billie Holiday claim that she wrote the song, and maybe that's true. Who knows? Anyway, doesn't matter. Song's a little awkward, but this ended the night at the only integrated club in New York City for night after night after night. It was this moment of Communist Party, Black nationalism, it was everything all at once.
And the cultural question, though, is where Black nationalism, particularly around Harold Cruz, I actually find The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual highly illuminating, despite its weird, mixture of philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism at the same time. That what you see is a movement by a lot of these Black artists to distrust the CP, because they start seeing the CP as really downstream from Russian concerns, and they start seeing Russian concerns being increasingly nationalistic. And they also see they also blame, in the U.S. context in specific, the dominance of Jews, who are increasingly seen as white and no longer allies, with their own inability to fully manifest in the CP. And so you have the whole Black cultural question and the march out. And with that, you have a lot of Black novelists who were originally supported by the CP. Not so much Lorraine Hansberry, who stays in the CP, but people like Richard Wright and James Baldwin, who go off and abandon communism altogether.
Charles McKay is another one of these people.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there are a number of these. I'm not an expert in this field, but there are a number of these.
There's most of the Harlem Renaissance is actually patronized by the CP.
Yeah.
And they also have a strong relationship with the Jewish arts movement. The other thing that needs to be pointed out, though, in this context, is a lot of the Jewish members of the CP who did not go to Trotskyism are caught up in the partisan review, Congress of the International Freedom. It was basically an OSSCAA front to get a bunch of former communist artists to endust the American way of life in the 1950s as a form of McCarthyism. And so that's a further break in this. It's the Congress of Cultural Freedom. And they were doing this under of promoting democracy and the arts. Furthermore, also a big thing in the 1950s, which Eisenhower recuperates, is all these folk movements get reincorporated into this national identity project, because they want to consolidate the national identity that began with the Civil War, and really only begins with the Civil War, into something that can be a fundamental anti-communist project. And so, ironically, all these CP and SP traditions get rebranded and reincorporated into the capitalist nation building project.
I hate to do this, but I don't hate to do this. I'm going to bring the reasoning right back around to what we said about the nature of technology and the relations to production that are called for by that level of technology. What's the folk movement? The folk movement traditionally in the United States, the way it's told, is that the folk movement's left. It's associated with the CP. It's Pete Seeger initially, and then you get this moment with Dylan, who's the great enemy, who goes electric, and doesn't even have the strength of soul to denounce the Vietnam War, and etc. Right? And then you have rock and roll sometime after that, right? And you have these two that is commercial rock and amplified music. That means we lots with little resources based on technology. Amplified music on the one hand, then folk music on the other. Well, they have something in common. Neither of them are part of the skilled craft union of orchestral and jazz musicians that go for years and study. This is something that you can pick up in your backyard. Now, that's great if you're in the peasant singer tradition, where it's about these agricultural, maybe even religious musics of a pre-capitalist pastoral past that you're bringing into the present in order to be populist. But the same conditions, that is economic conditions, that allow for that, allow Dylan to go electric. Because there's a continuity between these two things. You want to know the origin of rock and roll? Well, this is just, blacks weren't allowed in these unions, or in the conservatories. They were just barred from them. And so a lot of this music happened at a more individual level, right? You were with these petty entrepreneurs, so we would get together and form bands, et cetera. And that's if you were market inclined. So, this opposition that we normally consider structural for for the 1960s and 70s and part of the decadent period, and a lot of Marxists lament the death of the folk revival. But in political economic terms, it should have been expected.
Right. It should have been totally predictable. But then again, many things should be totally predictable in political economic terms.
I know, we live in hell world, Varn, we live in hell world. It's just, It's sad. And, if there weren't so many good TV shows, it'd be intolerable.
And why there's so many good TV shows that, and why can we all stream for hours and hours, which if it's not technologically based, driven on certain markets and rentier properties. And honestly, and I would say this interestingly, as a left content producer, it's actually freed us up because it's the first time in my life I don't have to have a rich patron. And priorly, you were either sponsored by a rich patron socialist, and they're still the people who sponsor most of the weird fringe sectarian groups, by the way. Let's just be honest about that. Mm-hmm. There's some, CPC sympathetic billionaire somewhere giving the People's Forum money or something. I mean, we know they are, but in the case of patronages, which is a petty proprietor relationship that we're all kind of dealing with, it has enabled us to have the gatekeepers be a broader group of people, basically your small donor patrons, than me having to have a private funder, which when I did socialist work priorly, even in publishing, was privately funded. And I keep on pointing this out to people because it's important. It actually was one of the things that destroyed the group because of the politics of the private funder going back and forth and who it supported. This is also a lot of your bigger socialist magazines and podcasts and stuff have similar private funders. They have to. That's why they had the stuff that they did. But this has democratized it. It comes with other problems, basically turning the entire left media sphere into a petty proprietor group that's going to trace really stupid trends to get eyes really quickly, to get a lot of money. But this is consistent with what we should be predicting from the model, because this is what, say, small rap labels did in the 80s and 90s, and this is the exact same market conditions in a lot of ways.
That's fascinating. So yeah, someone needs to take that apart. That a lot of the Marxist musicology out there that has tackled these popular music genres, but has almost always never tackled their political economic character, the character of labor. The level of lack of interest in academic music history, in the economics of musicians, or even in the lives of musicians. There are basic facts about the lives of famous composers that are mostly ignored by the discipline. And I'll give you an example. My favorite example is, there was a period where children who had beautiful voices and were shoved into a sort of church school, taught to sing. Passing nobleman hears the nice boy voice and sort of just steals the child. And then, stole more than once and then put into a court chapel, which just means choir. And then maybe they grow up to be a famous composer. But this is totally unfree labor. Bach was imprisoned for trying to take another job. These are conditions of incredible unfreedom for even exalted characters. Mozart complains about having to eat with the horsemen. Ditters von Dittersdorf becomes a von Dittersdorf in order to fake ennobled so that he wouldn't merely be a servant. Where the musician is in class society, and by analogy, where the artist is in class society, is changing all the time. You'd think you'd really care about what the class status of the musician is at any given point in time.
You would think that. In some ways, to get into lame ideological critique for a second, but this is the way in which ideology really is applicable. The music theory exists in some ways to remove music, our aesthetic theory, and artists from their modes of production and the lives of which that generate them explicitly. I mean, you see this explicitly in New Criticism Forward, which is the removal of the character of the artist and all this from the meaning of the work, which is presented, particularly by the time you get to like post-structuralist critics and the death of the author, as the full instantiation of the social consciousness as interpreter, but actually serves the function of you not knowing the context, class production, and otherwise of the work in which you're reading. It removes it from its historical context and puts it into, and even new criticism, frankly, is guilty of this in relation to the artist, even if it isn't in relation to what the artist is representing. And so, but new historical criticism, post-Foucauldian stuff in the States, for those of you who aren't academics and don't know what I'm talking about. And so you have a similar function in literature, where actually understanding the context for both the content and the production of the literature is aesthetically abstracted by the theories in which you criticize it. So you cannot see what it's telling you in some ways, unless it becomes, Stanley Fish to me is the ultimate bourgeois philosopher of aesthetics.
I've never read a word. I'm going to have to really admit that I've never read a word.
But yeah, that's fine, and you shouldn't. But because reader response criticism is this idea that our immediate response to it is what is valid, in any context of either its production as art or as its content as art is not particularly relevant to us, except in what we make, unless are renewing a meaning for it now, which treats every piece of art as an ahistorical consumer item.
Yeah, you said a magic word, actually, just then, and that's represent. Okay, so do our works represent things? The representational theory of art it really does come from a cognitive model. That is, it's a form of cognition that represents something. Like ideas represent something out in the world. A painting represents something out in the world. That's why painting is a form of knowing, etc. Programmatic music works the same way. But I prefer to talk about production and content as you did later, because, I mean, if you think, okay, what's the content of the milk in my fridge? Well, it's got a bunch of chemicals in it. It's mostly almonds. Is there a relationship between the content of the milk in my fridge and the social relations in which it was produced? Well, absolutely, right? So, the ingredients are going to be based on maximizing efficiency or cornering a market. There are lots of features of the item's content that are conditioned by broader social things, right? But I wouldn't say that the carton of milk represents something as a result, represents capitalist society or does anything else like that. And I think the same thing can be done to the arts. Arts have content, of course they do. And we've talked about what conditions those content, and there are lots of conditions. But does it have representational content? Well, I don't know. I guess my suggestion is no. It doesn't. It's just a useful object that can be great or terrible or meet our needs or not meet our needs.
My historical understanding would only nuance that when we're trying to understand art from a different time period, we probably should understand its context, even if it's not relevant to our enjoyment or consumption of it. Which I do. I mean, I do actually. If you were to get me off the side, say I see Stanley Fish's point to a certain degree, but ultimately, I think what this serves, when you do it solely at that function, is to remove our ability to treat art as something not particularly special, but that does have several, not just one, several contexts, of which you, as a node in that MCM circuit, frankly, are part of the context of, but you're not the only one. And particularly when this is created in a different time, which is the only thing about art that's interesting, is that we valorize art for much longer than we tend to valorize other commodities. Like, that's probably about it, actually, when we think about what commodity, and I think you see this actually, if you like in the anthropology of art, with ceremonial and decorative function items in anthropological society.
Yeah,
it's hard to call that art by any modern. The artists will go nuts because the decoration is for enjoyment, and it might actually have sacral or social functions, but it is not seen. The craftsman may be seen as skilled. But in pre-capitalist societies, pre-late medieval societies, crafts are crafts. They're not seen as a separate thing.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. No, I could agree more. And in fact, those connections to those ceremonial, those ceremonial functions, those use values that are peculiar to those past societies, are what that idea of a ceremonial being special. That ideology. And by the way, Dave Beach has done the Lord's work on unpacking the ideology, the fine arts, in a book that he just published about a year ago, 2 years ago with Pluto. The title of which I'm not remembering. Whereas these fine arts, they distinguish themselves, but they distinguish themselves because they hold the frisson of a role they played in a pre-modern society. And so they're attached to, they're attached to the lead arts, etc. There's also, by the way, a huge efficiency divide between these two forms of art. So, there have always been there's always been like a sort of at-home music making, the singing of lullabies or whatever, and the singing of serenades to loved ones and things. That's always happened. But then you had this other form of music making that took an insane amount of time and energy, and this was only sustainable because there was this incredible gap between the wealth and power of a tiny few who were able to monopolize the labor of so many. So once that starts to break down, you're sort of in trouble for your theory of the fine arts, or for your ideology of the fine arts. And as the ideology of the fine arts starts to attenuate, all that's left is anxiety. What we don't get is a Marxist revaluation of values here. And to say, well, what's a fine art? What makes an art fine? I mean, why should a Marxist ever take that concept seriously?
Yeah, why don't we just treat it as a craft, and a craft, once it's outside of its use value, is a commodity. A particularly irrational commodity is what we might call a stupid investment, like in fine art, which is where the social ideological function supersedes the other rules of capital, but can only do so because it is a luxury item and is thus not under normal productive constraints. Yeah. But this is also like my response all the way back to the beginning, when I was mocking the idea that like we wouldn't have poets. I'm like, no, we'd have plenty of, like, everybody could effectively be, if they have the natural skill or inclination, a poet. It's just that we would have democratized how much of that we're going to produce past the individual event. And yeah, I'm sure there would be some great arts, like there are plenty of great crafts, frankly, that we do not continue to do. There are some great machines, some great physical machines that are awesome and work forever from the 19th century. We don't make them anymore, not just because of planned obsolescence, although that is one of the reasons, and that would go away under a socialist society because you'd never do that. But the other reason is, frankly, the production of those machines was inefficient and can't be done efficiently, and the socially necessary labor time to produce them doesn't outweigh the benefits of making that particular machine. And capitalism is rarely super irrational.
That's right.
It can be, but it's rare.
That's absolutely right. And here it's worth reminding listeners of a distinction between personal production and social production. Look, I'm not kink shaming. You can make inefficient things all day long if you're done with your 4 hours social labor. You can do all kinds of crazy things on your own. We're talking about social production here. So the things that are production for the market by virtue of being social production. Anyway, we that we're at our 2 hour market, and
we haven't even gotten to me talking about how arts theory is fucked up by the differences between IP rents and commodity production, but that's a whole different thing.
From here on in, you just gotta tell me what to read, and then we can come on and talk about it.
Well, I've always been fascinated by the whole thing, The Artist in the Age of Material Production by Ben-Hameen, but I've never I realized that he doesn't understand. He doesn't really deal with the difference between commodities and rents at all. And it's just become more and more obvious what's going on as we move from the end of CDs into streaming services. Like, everything's trying to become a rent, because a rent's a steady form of income as long as the cash value's tied to production some way, in a way that matters. If it gets too disconnected, then everything falls apart and capitalism breaks down. Also,
there's a decline in the rate of profit. I don't know if you've heard. was a secular decline in the rate of profit. So it might have something to do with that. Either way, yeah, no, I mean, Benjamin doesn't know any more about value than Justin Bieber does.
No, he doesn't. I mean, he does make an interesting point about production, one that if someone had a good understanding of value could actually pick up on. But we're talking about a guy who basically was a Marxist for 3 years of his life and a Jewish mystic the rest of them. And
Yes.
I don't say that I love Benjamin, actually. I think he's I don't know why.
Great literary genius.
Yeah, great literary genius, very insightful, incredibly interesting, not really that consistent of a Marxist, and in so much that he is, it's only at the end of his life. So, yeah, I don't. There's a rude habit to go back and like try to find the Marxism in his weird Jewish mystical writings, and I'm like, no, those are weird Jewish mystical writings. Like, you can.
Well, who's that for? Who's that project for?
Entire specialist in the humanities, particularly in cultural studies, which a field whose existence I imagine pains you.
It's just sad, you know, and these people are so highly paid. It's just really, it's really terrible. Actually, the sometimes actually the worst is the cultural studies people who now are peddling to the left. I won't mention names, but there are some people who specialize in calling out academics for being, PMC. From a socialist perspective, and of course the people doing this are all PMC cultural studies.
Yeah, and also when you actually read their works, it's all cultural stuff based off of the assumptions of the social compact of the Great Labor Peace, and then they're like, but the PMC are different now, and I'm like, well, what possible reason why said quote PMC a class category that actually doesn't make sense and you don't bother to define
couldn't possibly
why what happened in 1960 that would have changed all that? I don't know. Somehow in a decade the United States have burned through its ability to hoard 49% of the world's wealth by being the sole survivor of World War II by rebuilding up and thus re-instigating in a normal profit cycle or something. I don't know why we would have had a profitability crisis 15 years later, dipshits. Like,
yeah,
supposed to be socialist, like not cultural critics.
They're the sorts of people. I remember first getting my university job and having this conversation with someone I adore and respect to the heavens. But we had this fun conversation where I call capital. That's how I refer to the book. And this person was just like calling it Das Kapital. And I was getting on my skin. And I said spontaneously, without thinking about that, how little respect this would show, I was like, only people who don't read the book call it that.
Capital. I will sometimes write Das Kapital just so people know I'm not referring to capitalism, the system, but yes.
Oh no! Look, there's no ethic here. I'm not suggesting there's a morality to it. I only by virtue of there are lots of Marxists, especially in the academy, who are Marxist to the end of their lives. But the last thing they really want to do is read Volume 3. That's just I don't know about
that. How many people do you know have gone through the ritual recitation of Volume 1 more than 40 times and never cracked Volume 2 because it's scary?
Well, let's not go. I had that experience in leftist circles, let alone the academy. In the academy, they don't get past the chapter on money.
No, they don't. Or maybe what they do is they find the weird chapter on machines in the Grundessa and just stop there.
That's right. Well, because Negri pointed it to them in what we've already acknowledged is the decadent period of all of this.
Oh my God! You look at Negri. Negri makes whole political theories after remove chapters of one section of Capital, and yet never mentions the rest of it ever.
It's very, very thrilling, and you can make whole careers like this. But anyway, I don't plan to. Well, we should stop because
we should stop. We're hitting 2 hours. And Stephan, you will probably be back to complain about something else with me since we get to be the even older Marxist in the rooms, and by that. Our Marxism's not your granddad's Marxism, not even your great-granddad's Marxism, is your great-granddad's Marxism. So you're going back 5 generations.
But for any men in the audience, I just turned 18. It's very important to remember.
Yeah, right. and since We will
I'm
leave it there.
All right.
Oh.